This is Mike Swanson. You're listening to the Wall Street Window Podcast. In a few moments, I'm going to be speaking with Carmine Savastano. Carmine runs the website tpaak.com. tpaak.com stands for title of a book he wrote called Two Princes and a King. Now, Carmine has a new book coming out this month with the title Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature. And in it, what Carmine does is he uses his knowledge of political and military history to delve into the psychological examination for mankind's propensity for aggression, which we see played out more and more in our television sets, our social media, internet, websites, and just our culture in general. But why are these things happening, and is there a solution? So these are some of the things Carmine talks about in his book. You can get it now. Go to Amazon.com, type in Human Time Bomb. All that said, one quick little break, and it's on with a discussion with Carmine.
Go ahead, caller.
I'm interested in the truth about the JFK assassination.
Right. Well, what do you want to know?
Judy Baker's wild claim, Oswald girlfriend, she knew Ruby and Barry, cancer weapons. Really?
I imagine I could claim I have four wheels. It doesn't make me a wagon, but okay.
Oswald was on the kill team and trying to prevent the murder of John Kennedy. Come on now. Has a real expert on the JFK assassination looked into her claims?
Go to Amazon.com, enter Judith Baker in her own words. You'll get results for a digital copy of a book where Walt Brown utilizes her own words and the known evidence in the case to get at, well, a different perspective, let's say. You can get Judith Barry Baker in her own words from the author himself, signed if you request it by contacting Dr. Brown at KIASJFK@AOL.com. It's a fun book, and it actually dissects the many, many fantastic claims. Judith Barry Baker in her own words.
Thank you for all the great information.
How you doing, Carmine?
I'm good, Mike.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk with me and all my listeners. We've done many interviews over the past year or two, but you have something exciting coming out on February the 17th. Your book, Human Time Bomb, will be released. People can buy it pre-order, though, through Amazon.com. But time's ticking down, and it's going to be, they won't just be pre-ordering it; they'll be reading it. So, what made you decide to write the book?
Well, I think what initially made me decide to write it was, as you know, we've had discussions before, both off and on the air, where we talked about, intelligence operations, assassinations, warfare, and just the history of, various international conflicts that have happened, ranging all the way from ancient history all the way to modern history.
And I think that's where most people know of your stuff on the internet from, your previous book, Two Princes and a King, about the three assassinations in the 1960s, JFK, King, and RFK, but also on various podcast shows. One's bigger than mine. You've done a lot of presentations and discussions about historical topics and stuff involving intelligence and foreign policy and so forth too. So this is a bit of this is something a little different from what I think most people know you for.
Yeah. It's what was it? One of our friends, David Vieta, was actually kind enough to write up something for a blurb for the back of the book, and he talked about how I showcased, not just understanding about military intelligence, but anthropology and biology and other things. And I had some understanding, but yeah, definitely the research for this has taught me quite a bit about not only science, but about our nature and about people. And that went back to, as you asked, the reason why I wrote it was because I ultimately wanted to try, I don't know if I'll ever answer the question fully, but at least come to a greater understanding of why we're violent as people, not just, the the vague, why are we violent, but what it is exactly within us, within our biology, within our society, that makes us violent and makes us want to kill other people. What gives us the thought that it's justifiable to do that?
Well, how does that connect with studying something like the JFK assassination?
Well, I think it came down to ultimately the people always ask why about JFK, but I think that they don't. I wanted to go back to the roots of it all. What came into the mind of the person or people who decided to author these assassinations? Not just JFK, but every assassination. Julius Caesar. What was it that made people decide to author plots against, as with President Lincoln? It wasn't just Lincoln. Members of his cabinet were targeted too. What is it that keeps occurring throughout history at these pivotal moments that makes people think that that is the preferable road? I mean, I suppose you can look at the most base side of it and think, well, it's the easiest, it's violence, but why does it come to us so easily? That's one of the questions I wanted to know the answer to. What, triggers it so quickly within us that we'll just leap straight to violence and forego any sort of diplomacy? I mean, is it just that we're all, at some level base creatures and we can't help ourselves?
Well, that would imply that genetics and inherited traits and almost being an animal is the answer.
Well, I think in that is part of the answer. I think that people don't understand that we are, foregoing any arguments about religion, which everyone is free to believe what they like, but going off of what we can verify from science, we are descended from primates. We are, it's within the high 90 percentile that we are a match for chimpanzees, being one of our closest primate relatives. And they're very violent. And if you look at all of, there are gorillas that are peaceful, like bonobos, that people will, try to use as a counter argument to our connection with chimps. But if you look across the primate species, it's a violent species, and there's a lot of domination involved, and there's hierarchies that are set up with violence. Now, there is justified violence. There's defensive violence. There's violence to, prevent someone from harming you and people you care about, but it's kind of built into the system. It really is within our internal wiring, within our very brains. Violence is set up in some ways. We talked about in some of the prior shows, fear, disgust, and status. Those are just some of the things that can drive us into violence, but it's there. It's always there. The violence is always beneath the surface. So in a way, we are animals, and it's sort of an eternal fight with our animalistic side and compared to our rational side. And that's where our environment and the society we live in can have a great effect on us, and starting with our families, because those are the people we first learn from, our families and our friends. We learn our socialization from them. We learn our strategies for coping from them. And then it just, larger and larger, it expands until you make more friends, business associates, strangers, and it's just an ever expanding realm of people all trying to operate, all with different levels of coping mechanisms. And, it just takes this one trigger that can set violence off in one person and have, catastrophic effects for large amounts of people. I'm sure at one time, perhaps in, I believe it was Serbia, when some anarchists thought they were just going to take out this high official, it wasn't going to be a big deal, and it was the Archduke Ferdinand. Now, I'm not saying that all historians just say, there's a direct line between Ferdinand and the war, has to necessarily be, but it certainly was one of the precipitating events. So the violence being carried out by someone who doesn't seem very important on someone who might be important can have even greater importance to world events. So that's what really gave me interest in it, is I wanted to understand why one person could snap and forever change history in a way.
Well, the flip side, I guess, would be people who would say, things are normally people are peaceful and the violence is the exception to the rule, and it's being caused by unusual disturbances or something. But one thing I like on this topic, thinking as you're talking about this, is some of the Stanley Kubrick movies kind of are metaphors for this. So I'll just point out one, The Shining. I think a sub-theme of that movie, and I'm talking about the one made in 1980 by Stanley Kubrick, not the recent one, is that the characters are going to this mansion that's a hotel for the wealthy, and they're going to be caretakers of it, but it's haunted. But the hauntings of this place are really past violent acts, and the movie makes all sorts of suggestions to history, such as the massacre of Indians. It talks about it hints about the people that founded the Federal Reserve and so forth, and parties that they held at the mansion. But I think what they're trying to imply is that our history of the United States is very violent. In fact, a little piece of trivia I didn't know. I was flipping through the History Channel, and they had a show on there. No, it was on Netflix. They had a show on there about Hitler's train. So Hitler made this special train he'd go all over the place with before the war started, and used it during the war. But he called the train America. And they said the reason why he called it that was because he really liked the way we settled the West by getting rid of the Indians and taking over the whole continent. And he wanted to do the same thing with Russia, basically. And I've read statements where he's said that, so it wasn't something just said in this documentary. Mm-hmm. But he named the train America, and then when he declared war on the United States, he changed the name of it to something else, which is kind of funny. But anyway, I'm kind of rambling on, and I'm not trying to pick on the United States. I'm just trying to use that as a metaphor that all society seems peaceful and normal, and it is. I'm not in the threat of violence now or about to be, but the substructure it's built on a legacy of a lot of violence.
Well,
and continues. We just hide it or don't even see it.
Well, the thing is, what I would address first is what the belief that people have that we are peaceful. That's just not true. We're not peaceful. I can't remember. It's in the book, but there's a study that basically shows that over the course of human history, only about during 8% of it were we at peace. There has always been a war going on somewhere on Earth. There's always been a big conflict going on, whether it was tribes or whether it was nations, or now whether it's blocks of nations that are fighting. It's always been going on, and it always will go on to some extent. All we can really do is minimize the amount of violence that's going on. But, that is our animalistic nature that always comes out. It's just a matter of environment. It's a matter of how many coping skills a person has. But under stress, no matter how peaceful the human, put them under enough stress and they will become violent. So, and the United States, as you said, yes, has a very violent history, but it has a very short history. There are other countries who have a very violent, long history, like Russia. Especially in the last century. I actually cover in the book, I cover the United States since its founding, a summary of some of the most violent periods, and then I compare it to about roughly a little bit about a century of Russian history, of the last century.
Do you think there's much difference between an individual act of violence, let's say a murder, committed by one person, versus organized violence done by a government or a tribe or something?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I think it's much worse when it's formalized, when it becomes a systemic thing. With because if it's a murder, a single murder, even multiple murders, usually not in every instance, of course, but usually there's going to be crimes of passion. There's going to be disputes that are long-standing. There's going to be not justifiable reasons, but there's going to be just reasons that a human would understand that a person under stress would try to use as a justification. Mitigating circumstances. For instance, when someone gets accused of murder, if you're accused of murder, but that person has beaten you up multiple times before you murdered them, you're going to have mitigating circumstances. When it's formalized and it's state-run, that to me is the most evil type, because it has been ensconced in a system by the society. So whether or not people, Germany, of course, is an easy comparison. Any society, though, that's done something like that, where a genocide has occurred, the people can say they didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't know, but there is a willful ignorance to that. And if the government has had enough time and power to set up a system that is so obvious, you can't really say you were totally ignorant of it. So I think that is much more evil. There is no mitigating circumstances for that. There is no justification for a government setting up, its power to expressly exterminate people.
No, I would think not, but
and that's
all this would imply, though, that the structure of the state or the group or the character of the leaders has a big impact on what happens.
Oh yeah, definitely. It certainly, you can see that. I think, America's a great example for that at certain periods, but also Russia. As much as I and others might have disagreed with the violence and the tyrannical methods used by Trotsky and Lenin, they were schoolboys compared to Stalin. Stalin created mass murder on a scale of, using the state that even Hitler couldn't rival. And that's always something that struck me as strange in history anyway. I understand both of them are, vile creatures that, no one would ever want to consider any sort of a role model. But for all the talk of Hitler and what he did and the horrors he did perpetrate, which are grievous, Stalin's numbers were almost double in some cases. Stalin didn't just do it to other people. Stalin did it to his own people. He killed them.
That's who he really did it to. I've read a book about him a year or two ago, and that's one thing that really stands out. Like with Hitler, it was all about us and them, let's say, right?
Yeah.
The Germans and the enemy. But with Stalin, it was the internal enemies all the time, Yeah, he was doing continuous purges and having continuous crises over and over and over again. And in a certain way, I think Mao replicated this in the 50s and 1960s, but I don't have the knowledge I do on that as I do on Germany, and what I know about Stalin I'm not no expert, but
yeah, well, it certainly seems similar. Maybe Mao wasn't. I don't know if necessarily Mao was as pernicious. I don't know if he meant for all those deaths that did happen eventually. Maybe it was just really bad planning in a lot of cases. But with Stalin, that was the express goal. And as you said, it was a never-ending. It was like almost 2 decades, roughly. It was of never-ending purges. And at one point, it went from not just people getting purged, but then if people talked about the people who had been purged, they got purged until no one talked about anything anymore.
No, this seems to be for both him and Mao. I think this was a mechanism that they used to stay in power.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to launch these campaigns continuously. I think that was a strategy that they used, much like a cult leader might use, you know, to control their followers, which is something I don't think Hitler was doing, as you mentioned. But anyway, that's just, you know, that's the thing. This is such a big topic.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know,
Yeah, you
we could
can go
talk,
into 1,000.
go in 1,000 directions, and I want to, you know, we're just kind of setting it up for more shows. But your first chapter, you know, you start out talking about the influences of nature, and then you talk about the environment, which is somewhat a little bit of what we're talking about. But I'm curious, though, what do you think if we think of today's environment? If the environment has an impact, and obviously both have some sort of impact, you know, nature and environment. But if environment has an impact, how is that changing now? Like, is the environment we're living in, and the listener, all of us, do you think it's making violence happen more frequently or less frequently?
Well, I think that here's the thing. I think that it's likely a combination of factors. I think there's definitely the propensity for violence to occur a lot more in modern times, because not necessarily that people are more violent naturally. You know, there are going to be, of course, naturally occurring genetics that predispose people to being more aggressive and more violent. But I think the problem probably in the last 20 years is that people don't have as many coping skills to prevent becoming violent. And that's why we're seeing more violence.
Well, you mentioned a study in the book that people who are today 18 years old, a psychiatrist, Jean Twenge, says now act like they're 15. Like, people are maturing at a slower rate. And part of the reason you say, or cite someone saying, is that actually this is happening more with children who have high income parents, and so the children don't have to work, where when the kids do work, they grow up faster. So maybe is it they're being too soft or something, I guess.
Well, it's the environment. You know, I don't think it's an intentional thing on behalf. You know, every parent wants to provide for their kids. They want to give them the best life that they possibly can. But if you remove, you know, we hear about, I can't remember what they're called, bulldozer parents, I believe is the term I heard recently. But basically, they're parents who will go in and bulldoze all of the problems of their child's life out of the way for them. Anything that might cause them a problem, the parents will knock out of the way, whether it's a teacher or whether it's a challenge or whether it's a sports team or someone talked to them in a way they don't like. These parents will go and do what the child should be doing. And that's the problem, is that you're infantilizing these kids. You're not letting them go out there and make mistakes and learn in controlled environments and develop their own social skills. So later on in life, when your parents can't bulldoze things down from you, you don't have the skills to defend yourself, to cope. And, you know, that's just one example. You know, you can put that into, you know, other examples where you have now people are having a harder and harder time getting jobs that they're happy with or jobs that they can deal with because they don't have the basic skills to get through a job interview. They're expecting, you know, they can't show up to work on time. That's a basic skill. Everyone should have that. To be able to go somewhere on time is important. And it's a skill that most people should have down by the time they're 20.
Yeah.
But we're seeing that that's not the case. I've even, you know, talked to friends that work at corporations that are making policies to allow some of these people to come in late because they can't come in on time. I mean, that's not going to help. That's not going to make business better. That's going to make your corporation worse.
Yeah, I don't know how they can run a business like that.
You can't. not a profitable one. So yeah, and that's just one example. But there's going to be some large costs if we don't start correcting this, and we don't. The first thing we have to do is acknowledge it's happening, and there's a lot of people that don't want to acknowledge it's happening. I saw an article I was actually very happy with, and the other day that the emotional support animals, which everyone, of course, is free to their opinion. I think that largely a lot of that is nonsense. I think that it's fine, people who are blind, people who actually require a CNI dog or an animal to help them, that's fine. If it's a legitimate reason for a diagnosed condition, sure. I have no problem with that. But when people start bringing on miniature horses and peacocks and badgers and snakes for emotional support on an airplane, that's nonsense. And I actually saw an article that they're going to start banning the unions of the poor flight attendants who had to deal with all this Noah's Ark stuff have filed enough complaints to where they're finally going to stop it.
Yeah, I never, I don't always know what's going on. And 4 or 5 years ago, it was another one of these casino stories, but I was playing poker in a casino in a poker tournament, and someone had one of these dogs at the table. And I didn't know what the hell was going on. And after a while, I was just.
You're seeing if his cards were Braille.
After a while, it was a tiny dog, but I never seen that before. And after a while, I had to ask, why do you have a dog here? And they said it's for emotional support from their doctor. And this guy ended up. I didn't say anything else. It was just so bizarre. And then the guy ended up losing, and then someone at the table started complaining and saying they're glad the guy's gone. And then they explained to me about, they are able to take these dogs on airplanes and I understand if someone's blind, why they would have an animal like that. I have a good friend of mine actually that is blind now. But other than that situation, it makes no sense. And it's just crazy. And I didn't know that. I mean, there's things going on. I'm so far behind the times. I don't know what's going on half the time. And then I countered that, and then you start noticing them on the airplanes, and the craziest, one of the craziest things that shut up is last year I went to a minor league baseball game in Raleigh-Durham, a AAA game, and it's an hour from me, and I just went by myself because it was during the afternoon, and they're playing the Orioles team. I wanted to see it. But anyway, I get there, and there were dogs everywhere inside the stadium.
Yeah.
And they were sitting in chairs. They were sitting, thousands of dogs. And what was going on is, and it was all younger people with these animals, and they had a special dog day. And it's just something I never saw anything like that.
Like they don't have, it's almost like they don't have the basic coping skills to do normal activities.
I mean, who brings a dog to a baseball game? Or some sporting event. That's just what was. I just like, this is so crazy. But the world is.
It's codependent. It's very.
But I'm behind the times. They would think I'm crazy to complain about it, and so I kept my mouth shut.
Well, I usually try not to make complaints, but I will say something. Like, I have relatives who are really big about bringing their dog everywhere, and I'm not a fan.
And what do they do? Especially like bringing a dog to play with you to play poker. What do you do when it poops?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a host of reasons why you don't bring animals to every social event you go to, but yeah, that's definitely among them. It's unnecessary, and that's just another one of the things where I was talking to you about the infantilism that seems to be creeping over society, where
Yeah.
people can't just be people. Where you don't, for instance, like the plane rides. So you're telling me you don't have the emotional stamina to last for 2 hours on a plane without an animal next to you.
Well, I don't understand. Well, one time some people don't. Some people are afraid to fly, and some
Yeah,
people, you know, have never flown before.
yeah.
And one time I have a friend of mine. He flew somewhere, and I picked him up from the airport, and he'd been off the plane now for 20 minutes. By the time it takes to get off the plane and so forth, get your luggage and all that, he'd been 20 minutes. So I'm picking him up, and he was shaking. His hand was still shaking from the fear of landing on the airplane. But if you're that scared, how's the animal going to help?
Yeah, and how is
I
the animal
don't,
not going to get
how's
upset
it going to comfort you?
Yeah, and
I don't understand that.
how's the animal not going to get upset too because they can sense stuff like that and then freak out on the
Yeah,
plane and cause a problem
yeah,
for everybody else? Yeah, if you're that afraid of flying, don't fly.
yeah. But I don't. The story you said is going to cut all that out.
Well, they're going to, yeah, the unions supposedly have made a deal with the air carriers where they're going to make it so it's only for dogs and it's only when necessary. If it is for blind people or someone with an emergency, a medical emergency where they need the animal there. Because, like I said, it got ridiculous to where people were abusing it so badly that they had miniature horses on the planes. Can you imagine? Do you understand how probably uncomfortable it is to sit next to somebody who's big on a plane, let alone to then have to sit next to people and their miniature horse?
Yeah,
That's
forget about dogs pooping. What happens when the horse
exactly.
poops?
Oh yeah. Well, what happens if they freak out? I mean, some people were
They
bringing
start running.
yeah, badgers and stuff. I mean, lizards, snakes. It's crazy.
Well, this is all a symptom. I think part of it. Uh, it it's a symptom of a societal trend, I guess, is one way people could look at it or
Yeah,
feel, and now hopefully it's stopped, right?
well, we're hoping. Yeah, I mean, well, at least curbed. And I'm hoping the book will help with people to be able to realize that we have to curb some of these things because they're just not. They're not beneficial. They're just making things more and more ridiculous. And like I said, if we allow the creeping infantilism to continue and we don't stop it, then people have no reason not to try to keep pushing this ridiculousness in
Hmm.
any way that they can. It's kind of like arguing with a child who's intent on something. You can argue with them till the end of time, and you can try to reason with them, but that's not going to stop it. So what you have to do is you actually have to assert why these things have to be changed. You have to actually let people develop on their own. All this strength is within these children if their parents will just let them learn to develop it and guide them as best they can without trying to bulldoze everything down in front of them. We're all very resilient, but we have to have the chance to succeed and fail. If all you do is knock all the challenges down in the way of someone, they're never going to develop as a strong person on their own, and they're going to expect you to do everything for them for the rest of their life.
And that turns into disaster.
Yeah. Yeah. And one day you won't be able to. There will come a day when the parents are gone and they have left this person without any of the basic skills they need to survive.
Well, how does this connect with the theme of your book?
Well, in the book, I talk about how that's one of the reasons. The creeping infantilism is one of the reasons why people are becoming more violent, because they don't have the adult skills to deal with the stress. because they have been allowed for so long to just shriek and attack whatever gets in their way or expect others to do it for them, that they don't know how to deal with something where they actually might have to, rely on their own self-sufficiency and be able to cope with it without any emotional support animals, without any help from outside sources.
Well, do you think this device Amazon has called Alexa could be a substitute for an emotional support animal or parents?
Yeah, an electronic one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I have no. Well, and that's another thing. Technology is great for some things, but we can also become so over-reliant on it that we weaken ourselves to the point that it becomes a detriment. Kind of like, it was when we were at that. I did a conference with Mike in Dallas a couple of years back, or was it last year? Was it last year? I think it was last year, or was it the year before?
It was the year before last year. It's 2018.
Okay, 2018, yeah. So, but when we were down there, they, and I'm sure everybody has it, but they had that, me being like you, I kind of don't keep up with all this stuff. They had Grubhub where they would deliver your food to your room. I knew they had delivery, but this was, you could get anything you wanted and they'd bring it from across the city to you. So, but that's a convenience, yes, and it's handy, but it also makes us lazier. It also makes it easier for us not to have to go out and socialize with other people. And it's as these conveniences stack up as time goes by and innovation occurs over and over, you find that you're having to deal with other people less and less. So you're not developing the social skills that you need to deal with people, which means that your stress levels, your baseline is reduced. It takes a lot less to make you upset or even violent than it normally would because you're not dealing with people. You're becoming more detached. So that's where it attaches. All these technological, and not just technology, but just all the societal changes that insulate us from other people, that don't require us to have to.
One thing about your book is, and I told you, I kind of thought on this topic, and myself too, also from studying history and these type of other topics. And one of the thoughts I had, and I'm not going to do it, but the title you came up with is perfect, Human Time Bomb, for your book. But I thought of the idea that people are political animals, meaning that we're social animals and we want to be in groups and interact with each other and all this kind of stuff. And that's the way we are. And I was going to think of ways to connect that to the themes in your book of violence and so forth. But the thing about that kind of idea that we're supposed to be social animals or political animals, I get that idea that we're political animals from Aristotle. That's what he says. So I'm not using it in the meaning that we all go vote or something.
But we all take part in politics because we all take part in status.
Yeah, and you talk about that. We talked about that the other week. But the thing is, these devices and using the internet all the time doesn't really provide what human interaction does. It tries to fulfill these, whether they're biological needs or created socially or whatever, however they're there. And I think some of the frustration these people have is not having these needs fulfilled by being so antisocial. Not going to the restaurant and not being able to sit down and eat with people. Instead, you have to order and leave. And in fact, I read an article a few months ago saying that there's these Amtraks that go across the country, long distances overnight. I've only been on one for 6-8 hours at the most, but you can take one from like Chicago to the West Coast, and it takes a long time. And there's people that have liked to go on these trips because they just like to be on the train and ride it and kind of get away from everything. But they also like to eat in the dining room, because the way the trains do it is they'll assign you a table, and you're going to eat. If you're by yourself, you're going to eat with 3 other people you don't know. If you're with if it's only 2 of you, they're going to seat you with 2 people you don't know. So you are forced to meet people, and Amtrak is saying they're going to do away with that and just give people food that they can take into their rooms, so they don't have to eat with other people, under the demand of younger people who get triggered and upset and don't want to do it.
Yeah. And I mean, what are the long-term costs of socialization? We're seeing little, and I mean, we see little things like that with Amtrak now, but as that spreads, as people cannot cope with dealing with people who might disagree with them on minor issues, what is the cost, to the larger society? We've already seen that the birth rate is down, and that's not recovering. We've already seen that people are becoming less and less inclined to socialize with each other. What happens eventually if you're not replacing the people and nobody's getting together and creating new people because nobody wants to socialize? I'd say that's how a society falls.
Well, the birth rates are dropping all throughout the world.
Yeah.
Even in China, used to say you couldn't have but 1 or 2 children. I think now they dropped that restriction, and they're trying to encourage people to have more children there.
Well, modern people aren't having as much sex. They're not getting into families as early, if at all. They're not even leaving home sometimes into their 30s.
Yeah, it's
average.
Something else.
So. Yeah, and these trends have to be curbed and eventually corrected, or else it's not going to go anywhere anyone will want to be in about 40 or 50 years. Because then you're going to have a society run by people who don't know how to socialize with other people and who don't know how to cope. And that is not going to be good.
No. Well, I'll let you take off. We've been talking for some time, and we'll do a follow-up and get deeper into your book. And everyone needs to go and order it and grab it so they can find out everything you're saying and then follow along with us.
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And as Mike said, yes, the book is Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature. It's available on Amazon. It'll be coming out February 17th, 2020.